It's time we saddle up and welcome to Double Issues. Wynonna Earp has got to be one of my all-time favorite shows. I mean, the humor, the monsters, the romance. Earlier this year, I got really back into it and rewatched all the episodes like 3 to 6 times. Made some questionable eBay purchases, and decided to read all the original Wynonna Earp comics. So, with the upcoming Vengeance special being bestowed to us by my new best friends over at Tubi, I figured there was no better time to talk about the Image comics series that kicked off a phenomenon. Along the way, I'll do my best to explain the context and content of the comics, with a pinch of show comparison thrown in for good measure. Wynonna Earp wasn't created explicitly for the comic, instead being a character that Bo Smith came up with in junior high school in 1966, at a time when cowboy westerns were still hot topic. In fact, The Good, Bad, and the Ugly came out that same year. It was a time when Gunsmoke was airing on TV sets, and John Wynne was given an honorary Golden Globe. Very different cultural context than now, where most of my fellow Gen Zers don't know who Wyatt Earp was. However, cowboys were still well known in the 90s, especially with Tombstone having come out in 1993. As far as the villains that Wynonna has to fight off go, they are largely based on classic monster movies from the 30s through 50s, like Dracula or Creature from the Black Lagoon. For a little more chronological context, the first Wynonna Earp issue debuted in December of 1996, and was published by Image under Jim Lee's Wildstorm imprint. The early 90s showed record sales numbers for Marvel, with books like Spider-Man, X-Force, and X-Men, each having millions of copies sold. Image's debut books turned a lot of its founders into millionaires. The market was booming because of speculators who thought that they could buy comics now and resell them in a couple years to make a fortune, unlike myself who buys comics now and knows it only hurts my bank account. When the speculators realized that this was not the case, it led to the late 90s market crash, and the speculators moved on to Beanie Babies. In fact, in 1997, Marvel even filed for bankruptcy, so one can imagine that when Earp hit the scene, the market was less boom and more fizzle. Meanwhile, Bo Smith's comic career started with Eclipse Comics in the 80s, where he would end up collaborating with characters like Chuck Dixon. None of these titles are especially well remembered. Swords of Texas and Black Terror aren't exactly classics, but moving into the early 90s, he would get some work with DC, including, and I cannot say this sarcastically enough, the incredibly beloved Guy Gardner Warrior series, where he would even get to work with soon-to-be Wynonna Earp penciler Joyce Chin. So without any further ado, let's dive into issue 1. Introducing U.S. Marshal and great-granddaughter of Wyatt Earp, Wynonna Earp. She's one of the top Halloween hunters, who deal with supernatural threats. Wynonna easily dispatches Morphin Mars Johnson and his faux hostage/girlfriend, quickly establishing herself as a force to be reckoned with and very good at what she does, even if what she does isn't very nice. Wynonna is soon alerted to a new mission in San Diablo, New Mexico. We switch focus to Bobo Del Rey, sitting in his trailer and watching the Andy Griffith Show. A customer walks in looking for hemo, a new drug that essentially turns its users into vampires. After the customer trash talks Bobo's favorite show, however, he is murdered, and Bobo keeps his money and car. Honestly, a reasonable reaction when somebody trash talks your favorite show. The book ends with Wynonna touching down in New Mexico. If you're familiar with the show, then it becomes very apparent very quickly how different the comics are from the show they inspired. In Bo Smith's own words, "I gave Emily Andres a loaf of bread, she took it and made sandwiches for the world." The titular Wynonna Earp and villain Bobo Del Rey are the only characters carried from the book into the show, and even then, both characters are drastically different from their on-screen appearances. Obviously, this means that central characters from the show, such as Dolls or the immortal Doc Holliday, aren't in the book, including the two characters that are a part of the ship almost as ubiquitous as the show itself, Waverly Earp and Nicole Hott. Wynonna in the comic is described as being obsessed with her great-grandfather's career, an Olympic-level athlete, and the ability to keep a cool head in any situation. Meanwhile, in the show, Wynonna is wisecracking, hot-headed, and a barely functioning alcoholic, and we love her for it. While both are descended from Wyatt Earp, only TV show Wynonna has a curse placed on her and inherits Peacemaker because of it. Comic Wynonna just happens to be an Earp, no special power required. Meanwhile, Bo Smith intentionally created Bobo Del Rey as a subversion of the classic pretty boy vampire, a la Interview with the Vampire. Instead, Bobo hails from clan Immortalidad. These vampires gain leathery lizard-like hides in the daylight, and can usually be found sipping an RC Cola or a classic blood bag. The show version keeps his trailer park, but turns him into a remnant, a demon killed by Wyatt Earp back in the Old West, and brought back to life every time the Earp heir turns 27. Or sometimes when the Earp heir dies. It's a little inconsistent, TBH. While the characters differ wildly across mediums, it still follows Smith's original goal: to bring the sense of Western justice into the current day with a little sci-fi, a little horror, and a pinch of pop culture, even if that pop culture has shifted in the 20 years between the two. The 2003 Home on the Strange series shows a closer path into what inspired the TV verse. In Home on the Strange, Wynonna fights a group of immortals initially shot by Wyatt Earp, whose Old West villain's immortality is tied to the Earp bloodline, much like the show's Revenants. She also gets a sword that's able to kill mortals, not via magic, but rather a metal called diamanium, and parts of the ship that crashed at Roswell. Not exactly Peacemaker, but you can see the red string. Honestly, the biggest change the show has to make is the mental gymnastics it takes to make a show about a U.S. Marshal who lived in Arizona's descendant to have all her adventures in Canada. Opening issue 2, we see Wynonna take down a gang of hemo-dealing bikers at the Cactus Bar and have them locked up. But when the vampires go on the attack, she has to fight them off too, and heads to the trailer park via horseback before even more vampires come after her. She fights them off, and they shoot her horse down. Just as she thinks she's safe, a snarling werewolf approaches. I think capping off this issue is as good a time as any to talk about the art in this book. The pencils in the first 3 issues are by Joyce Chin, who has done work on properties like Vampirella, Tomb Raider, Fritzonia. Needless to say, if there's a sexy lady, Chin has probably drawn her. She also has plenty of covers with Marvel in more recent years. Chin got the job on Earp after a phone call with Bo Smith when he had already looked at a couple other artists. She certainly draws her ladies pretty shapely, but honestly, comparing her to some of her peers, her women aren't as exaggerated as others draw them, or as some would draw Wynonna later in the same series. Chin likes drawing her female characters to be a bit absurdly proportioned, and others described her as the girl who draws like guys. She brings a good sense of action into all the pages. Smith even cites her attitude as inspiration for Wynonna's own personality. Chin's husband is fellow comic artist Arthur Adams, whom she met the same year that issue 1 of the series came out at San Diego Comic-Con in 1996. Her inker is Mark Irwin, whose list of work then included titles like Wildcats and Backlash, but would go on to do a lot more with the big two and then becoming the president of Mad Cave Studios. In issue 3, Wynonna teams up with some bounty hunter werewolves to track down the vampire clan. The trio ride their motorcycles straight into the hell on earth with a hillbilly twang that Bobo's gang is causing. Bobo's girlfriend uses herself as a body shield before Bobo himself attacks Wynonna, who expertly cuts off his right arm with a bloop. Wait, a bloop? Batman 66 called, it wants its sound effect back. Bobo grows to a massive size, and Wynonna needs her lycanthropic friends to lend her some backup fire. She finally lands the final blow by feeding Bobo holy water, which causes him to turn into a smoldering mound. She says goodbye to the werewolves with a kiss on the cheek as we get one last look at Bobo's TV Guide subscription. Smith confirms in the next issue's letters page that Bobo might not actually be dead since he's a vampire and all, but since we never see him return, it strikes me as similar to how Shredder was initially killed off in the first issue of TMNT, or how Joker died at the end of his romp in Batman #1. Even plot can't keep a good bad guy down. On an unrelated note, it's so rare to see a female hero wave her badge around as she takes on a supernatural bad guy and carries a legacy of fighting behind her. What? No, not like Witchblade. This is totally different. Wynonna has at least 75% more clothes. Only kidding. Those similarities are obviously only skin deep. I mean, Witchblade got a TV show way sooner. Honestly, comparing Wynonna to some of its contemporaries, I'd definitely rather read it than some of the other Image titles like the verbose early Spawn or Wildcats. Honestly, there's some pretty great lines in the book, so let's go through a couple of my faves so far. I guess it's gotta be a little strange working the freak cases, eh? Freaks, felons, natural, supernatural. It doesn't really matter, Agent. There's only one kind of prejudice when dealing with lawbreakers. Extreme prejudice. It's over. It's done. You're yesterday's mashed potatoes. Well, 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 at last, the long legs of the law, ashes to ashes, crap to crap. Before we head into issue 4, I feel the need to share that while I bought the first 3 issues off of eBay last month, my mom actually already had issues 4 and 5 in her short box from when they originally came out in 97, before I was even born. I found them back in 2019 when I first started watching the show, and it was just a delightful coincidence. In issue 4, Wynonna is led into a Manhattan comic shop via fellow Wildstorm Productions character Warblade. The shop workers ogle over her as she heads upstairs to a secret door to a secret government base. Wynonna gets briefed on the current situation. The heads of crime families across the world are being killed off, and their only lead is a strange Egyptian symbol left in the victim's blood. And Wynonna is handed a chunky 90s laptop with the rest of their intel. Seriously, you could crack walnuts with that thing. Meanwhile, at the New York Metropolitan Museum, an undead mummy called Raduk is released by some Egyptian mob goons. The Italian mafia sets out Nicholas DeFaro to find out who is killing the mafia heads. Wynonna is denied access into a club because she's a woman, so she smashes her badge so hard into the bouncer's head that it leaves an imprint. Impressed, Egyptologist Amir Tashir invites her to a date/tour of a Duat Tiamat experience. Once Earp arrives, however, it turns out to be a trap, as Raduk and the rest of the Egyptian underworld members, not literal underworld, just criminal underworld, take Wynonna as a vessel for Tiamat. Issue 4 gets a new penciler in the form of Pat Lee. He's mostly known for starting the short-lived and seemingly schemy Dreamwave productions. Personally, I prefer Chin's art for the book, as I find Lee's proportions can be a bit awkward, and his panel layouts aren't as clear. Lee's art is very 90s Image. Even Wynonna outfits go from uniquely Western to a plain bra and leather jacket, but I at least think his drawings of the mummy are pretty gnarly. Well, at least the first one is, and the later one shoots down to a 240p version. Now, before we dive into the final issue, I feel the need to share my Wynonna Earp X-Files conspiracy theory board, because even though, to my knowledge, Smith has never labeled X-Files as an inspiration, I find it hard to believe that it wasn't at least a little. X-Files was in its third season at the time Wynonna Earp was coming out, evidently, meaning that seasons 1 and 2 had already aired. Wynonna herself is specifically from a part of the Marshal's office that deals with weird cases and travels the US looking for threats, basically the same premise as the X-Files. At the very start of the series, she's explaining to local cops about the weird phenomenon she deals with and takes over the case for them. Also very common in X-Files. In this very issue, the geeks at the comic book store compare her to Gillian Anderson, the actress who plays the skeptic Dana Scully. In the letter's page says, "These are the cases Mulder and Scully would run from." In the final scene of the series, Wynonna teases an alien invasion. Fast forward 20 years in the future, which at that point isn't evidence, but it is just fun coincidence. And the Wynonna Earp comic series features 2 Black Badge agents that look a lot like Mulder and Scully, and in an interview, Emily Andras, the Wynonna Earp showrunner, jokes that Gillian Anderson should play Nicole Hott's mom. The show has been stated countless times to have a major Buffy influence, but I can't help but feel that it's not the only 90s cult classic show that Wynonna Earp franchise takes after. Alright, last on the chopping block is issue 5. Fittingly called Wrap Party, as it's the last in the series. Opens with the Egyptian mob in the middle of making sacrifices of Wynonna and the Italian mob boss, who they kidnapped last issue. Betty would have preferred that Horsehead. Wynonna is scantily clad in mummy wraps, which she will be wearing for the rest of the issue. The Italian mob kicks in the doors, and that Nicholas DeFaro guy from earlier frees Wynonna, steals a kiss, and reveals that the two were exes. The mobs start a brawl as Radek busts through a wall to attack Wynonna, and Nick lays as much lead into him as he can. Wynonna, once again relying on her knowledge of apparently highly accurate monster movies, feeds Radek some tanna leaves that turn him into smoke. They shoot the rest of the Egyptian mob members in the head. Wynonna thanks the Italian mob for their help, by agreeing to arrest them another day. Wynonna and Nick go on a date, closing the chapter with a kiss, before our final scene in this cut short series. The last 2 pages are dedicated to Bo Smith breaking the news to Wynonna that the series has to go on a hiatus for a while. "What do you mean, this is the last issue, Bo?" Well, don't look at it as the last issue. It's kinda like, a hiatus. Yeah, that's just it. A hiatus. Despite Wizard advertising Wynonna Earp as an ongoing series and the letters page of issue 2 teasing what would happen in issue 6, the initial series was capped off at a mere 5 issues. It was never the most popular series. Its first issue barely squeaked into the top 100 books of the month, sitting at 98th place, and sales steadily declined with each subsequent issue, though the character did manage to squeak into the Image Overpower card game expansion set from 1998. Wynonna would need to find a new home with IDW to continue her adventures in 2003, and Wynonna Earp Home on the Strange, for 3 issues, and then another hiatus until Wynonna Earp The Yeti Wars in 2011, that had 4 issues. 2016 saw the release of the award-winning TV series. In my opinion, the original Earp comic is like a B-. It's got great quips, Shin does great pencils, but it is impossible to forget that it's a 90s Image comic at the same time, and Wynonna herself isn't the deepest character. I've read every single Wynonna Earp comic up to this point, and I think that Home on the Strange was probably my favorite of the lot, if you were looking for any recommendations. And if they were ever going to make more Wynonna Earp comics, then I would kill Frista Sayich to draw Way Hot. I think it would heal me, personally. The show is still definitely my definitive version of Wynonna Earp, but going back and looking at where the series originated was still a fun, light read. I'd definitely rather reread the books Wynonna Earp was based on than rewatch the movie Buffy was based on, at the very least. The show really did expand on the concept in a perfect way. In Bill Smith's words, he can say that his original fan base of men ages 15 to 55 have now joined forces with his new fan base of women ages 15 to 55. I'm pretty sure both groups were still at least partially in it for the sexy ladies, though. So I'll leave you with a final quote from Wynonna Earp 1997's final letters page. "Most of all, I want to thank all of you that were the real heroes behind Wynonna Earp. You gave us the support and feedback that we needed to make this book a very proud piece of work. When this becomes a movie, TV show, toys, and the like, you can pat yourself on the back, because without y'all, none of this would be possible. See you again sometime on the trail."